All right, everyone. I hope you can hear us all very well. As you know, I'm an old soul when it comes to this damn technology and streaming and everything like that. But today, I think we'll have a very good and interesting conversation and stream here. We have our friend Pete from around the galaxy coming in to talk and kind of debate some of the Star Wars stuff that's been going on in the past couple years, particularly after the fall of The Last Jedi and everything that has followed it. And we come from two different sides of the fandom, but I think we both prove by being here today, we want meaningful dialogue and conversations around Star Wars in the hopes of bettering the brand going forward and everything like that. So, thank you, Lunga, for your immediate thing, calling me a tech noob. I know I don't have you running the show now. Pete Lunga is my 50-year-old friend who knows far more about doing any of this than I do. God damn it. But thank you for coming on, Pete.
Yeah.
How long have you been in the Star Wars fandom as kind of a what we do, I guess, which is like kind of content creation? I know you run a podcast and everything like
Yeah.
that. I know you used to work with like the magazine. I was at the Star Wars Insider magazine back in
It
the day.
it was Star Wars Galaxy magazine mostly back in the mid to late 90s. I did a couple things there. I was a managing editor, worked with Steve Sansweet, and I think I actually had the very first Star Wars content creator website. It was something called Echo Base, which is really funny because I know the guys at Echo Base Network, but it
Oh,
was
I
on
love them.
it was on it was on like GeoCities or something. It was, had flaming gifs. It was everything wrong with websites, but it was the first one out there, and that's how I ended up hooking up with Steve Sansweet, and then working, doing about a year and a half of Star Wars Galaxy magazine. I did do one or two things for Star Wars Insider, then went away for a while, and then about 5 years ago, started listening to Star Wars podcasts again, and said, "Well, that seems easy. I can do that." so um, I jumped back into it, and I've been doing Around the Galaxy and ATG Live, um, and a couple other things on our little network there for over 5 years now. It's been a lot of fun. It's been great to meet a lot of different people in this space.
And what do you think has been the difference becoming kind of a podcaster and content creator in the Star Wars fandom now for a bit of time as well? I mean, I started doing this back in 2014, 2015, just with
Wow.
Instagram and everything. A lot's changed over the past 10 years, but what do you think is the difference when you're doing this as we do it, as a
Mhm.
passion, side hobby, maybe a little side job or something, compared to just people who are just actively watching Star Wars?
I think what ends up happening is we end up, whether we want to or not, over analyzing and overthinking things and getting drawn into conversations and things that we might not normally get too active about. I think, for me, and it was an eye-opening experience for me and my co-host. We when the writer's strike was happening and the actors strike was happening and Ahsoka came out, we were very conscious of not promoting that show or doing after shows or even reviewing it, be out of respect for our friends who were actors and writers going through what they were going through. And we actually found it was kind of refreshing to be enjoying or watching. I'm not going to say I enjoyed all of it, but watching a show from a different perspective without constantly thinking, what am I going to talk about? What am I going to post? What am I going to, tweet about this? And it was an interesting way to do it. So I think what ends up happening is we end up kind of getting drawn into a deeper level, which may at times make it more difficult to enjoy.
I can 100% see that, especially after being involved with this, at least actively online for at least 10 years at this point. The conversation around Star Wars has changed so
Hmm.
much
Yep.
and into something that I kind of despise and everything at this point. And it's weird too because I vividly remember what it was like when the prequels were coming out and the kind of reaction people had to it afterwards and everything, but it felt like people kind of moved on from that conversation eventually. It was just accepted of, okay, maybe you don't like the prequels, let's just kind of stop talking about it.
Yep.
At this point, with the sequels and with the Star Wars brand and Lucasfilm under Disney as a whole, the conversation is still going to this day, and I can't stand this whole "oh, it's been 7 years since the Last Jedi" and everything kind of conversations. What do you think about it now? It's like, well, I don't think anyone's opinions about it have really changed, but the core conversations about that movie and the reaction to it are still there, which I think is very different from what we had with the prequels, because the prequels wasn't like an ideological complaint, really. It was more of an execution and maybe in a little ideological part on how Lucas was approaching it and everything. It seems like the vitriol today towards Star Wars is a lot more intense than it was 20 years ago with the prequels. And I hate that as a fan, but I can also kind of understand how the brand has gotten to this point.
Well, I think it's, I think first of all, 7 years since Last Jedi is not enough time um to really change an opinion on it, right? I mean, I was very fortunate because I was doing some of the work with Star Wars Insider and Star Wars Galaxy. I was at all three premieres of the prequels in New York City because I'm that
Oh,
old.
wow.
And I remember literally walking out of the Phantom Menace in a room full of celebrities. I mean, it was everybody from like John Leguizamo and Liam Neeson and Natalie Portman, and Donald Trump was there because he was a big New
Hmm.
York celebrity. And When the movie ended, everybody was kind of like shell shocked. They didn't know what to think because, much like the sequels and much like Star Wars in general, I think there was this expectation going into it that this is going to be, I'm going to get back to my childhood. Here it comes. And it didn't happen. And I think if you think about the sequels and you look at, there's a younger generation of, I have a 12-year-old son and a 15-year-old daughter, and my daughter loves Ray, loves everything about her. My 12-year-old son is huge into Clone Wars. That's another sort of avenue for Star Wars, but it's it's not owned by anybody yet. Much like it's like I have a lot of friends that grew up on the prequels. You grew up on the prequels, and they hold the same spot in your heart that the original trilogy does for me because I was 7, 10, and 13 when I saw the original trilogy. So I think it's hard to say that it will or won't get there. I do agree, though, that the conversation is different. I think um, the reason people didn't like the prequels was more stylistic and more expectations, and I think the reason people argue about the sequels is because I think it becomes more of a ideological standpoint, whether you want to or not. And then what happens is the the conversations are so intense that people end up having to take a side, right? I mean, the thing that I posted that got us to have this conversation where I admit it was clickbaity and engagement farming to say, if you don't like The Last Jedi, you didn't understand it. And I know that that's a overstatement for sure, but it was certainly it was a movie that didn't do what a lot of people expected it to do, which was the problem with the Phantom Menace for people who like myself who saw Star Wars as a 7-year-old. The Phantom Menace was not what I expected, not what I wanted. It wasn't Characters didn't do what I expected them to do. And so that's I think where the sequels still sit, but we live in a social media world, so you have a lot of people who just arbitrarily go out there and throw out a positive or negative comment, and all it takes is one comment on either side, and you've got a landfall of back and forth, which just gets stupid very quickly.
Well, I am glad you brought up the fans and the whole Last Jedi thing because as podcasters, we got to segue properly into things, and that was just such
Exactly.
a good way for me to segue into that little first point and everything. So, and like you said, I know you were being hyperbolic and teasing and everything like that. I do the same, of course, in my videos and everything. We all do that
Sure.
on the nature of YouTube and the internet. But I would say I do feel like that sentiment has been there for a long time now with the Last Jedi of the fans don't understand what it was trying to say,
Hmm.
and that it is a little bit more of a complicated film than the other 10 films that they've released and everything. And that's what starts a little tip for tat between me and you is that
Yeah.
the most people simply don't understand it and don't take the time to understand it, which I can see that point, especially with something like the Phantom Menace. But I would argue that this has become such a common sentiment among fans of the Last Jedi who have used this defense of the movie, and that the reason is it's disliked so much is that it's more complex than the other Star Wars film, and it challenges us as Star Wars fans on our view of the franchise as a whole, with things like Jedi and Luke and everything. But I would say over the past few years, I've seen the statement that fans don't understand this movie as almost a way to avoid a lot of criticism. I'm not saying that in your particular case, and
Yeah.
just specifically, but in general, this has become a very common statement for people, and I feel like it's almost similar to what prequel fans do today, which I can't stand. I'm not a big fan of the prequels at all, but people who say, "Oh, you don't like the prequels because you didn't understand them." They're secretly brilliant, and that's why they were hated when they're released. It's like I
No,
don't
they weren't.
believe that in the slightest. Yeah, no, they're not that I don't think any of these Star Wars films are really that depth or in depth or complicated like that. And I think it's disingenuous for the prequel fans to do it, and even now with the sequels in defense of something like The Last Jedi to use this defense. But I think more importantly, it takes away any ability to do what we're having right now, which is actually having a dialogue about these movies and what went wrong
Well,
with them.
you made an interesting comment, and that is that, the Star Wars movies, the prequels weren't that deep. The original trilogy, if you watch it now, it's funny. I was just referencing this last night on my show. How my 12-year-old son, who is a big fan of Star Wars, is he doesn't watch the original trilogy. It moves too slow for him. So every movie's a little bit
Oh,
different. But and I mean, he loves the characters, but he's got the attention span of a 12-year-old boy, right? So it's a little bit different. But that being said, your comment about Star Wars not necessarily being that deep, and I agree with you. I think it taps into a very sort of basic human storytelling thing, and when it works best, it's when it's action and adventure, when it's Revenge of the Sith, when it's The Empire Strikes Back, even when it's The Force Awakens. It's at its most basic. Let's go. There's a ABC type adventure. Just go for it. I think The Last Jedi, and I think the reason why for some people it's their favorite Star Wars and for others it's not, is because it's the most intimate of all the Star Wars films. It's not it's the most it focuses on character characters from a different angle than you normally see. And again, it's not for everybody, and I'm not saying if you didn't like it because of that's a bad thing. That's I think where it happens. So to me, like, The Last Jedi is the way I say it all the time is Last Jedi is my favorite Star Wars story, but of the 11 films, it's probably like 8 or 9 on the list of when I would throw on a Star Wars movie to watch. And that's a weird thing, but it tells me a lot about the movie in that I love the story, I love what it's about, but it's a very heavy movie, and that's not Star Wars.
well, and I personally don't feel like it's a fun movie.
Correct. Yeah, I agree with that.
It's
Yep.
odd, and I to at least have a frame of reference for it again before the stream, I was like, you know what, I'll just put it on and kind of rewatch it and everything. And even though I have a lot of complaints about the Phantom Menace, and I think that is one of the more boring Star Wars movies, it does have those fun elements like the pod race and
Yeah.
everything. And I don't feel like The Last Jedi has anything like that where you're watching and you're like, you know what, I may not like this stuff all that much, kind of like the Phantom Menace, but it is kind of fun. Even the Force Awakens had that a little bit.
Yeah.
And so it seemed like the approach that Ryan Johnson took, and it's so funny how I do feel like The Last Jedi almost broke popular culture with these kind of conversations and everything. But
Mhm.
it seemed like Ryan Johnson approached it of, well, this isn't really fun, but let's have kind of a referendum on
Hmm.
what you know as Star Wars, what the approach to Star Wars is, these heroes and characters and everything. And it felt so unnatural following The Force Awakens, which
Mhm.
was simple, was kind of fun, but still kind of give you that hint of a larger story. It seems like episode 8, The Last Jedi, derailed it so much that by the time you get to episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker, they reversed so many of the decisions from The Last Jedi. It became kind of clear that Ryan Johnson didn't follow the plan that J.J. Abrams either had or didn't have because there's so many conflicting stories on it. But there was a clear direction and tone that The Force Awakens set up. The Last Jedi kind of derailed, and the ending was so final. It was almost hard to imagine what could even come after it. And I think that's one of the issues with The Last Jedi and its legacy so far is that it really absorbed the entire conversation around the sequels. It took away from The Force Awakens and The Rise of Skywalker.
Yep.
We're going to talk about The Last Jedi for the next 10 years more than we'll probably talk about any other Star Wars movie.
Yeah, and I think that on the one hand, that's a reflection of what good movies are the ones you talk about the most, right? And I'm not saying that because there's a negative conversation means that The Last Jedi is a good movie. And again, let me be really clear. I don't expect to ever change anybody's mind when I have these kinds of conversations. I completely understand that there are people who are never going to change their mind, but there's reasons why I enjoy The Last Jedi as my favorite of the sequel films. But what's interesting too, we mentioned it really briefly early on in the conversation, is that the way the conversation is being had online, which is why I was excited to have this conversation with you. The way the conversation is had online is there's no way to defend your position. Because it just turns into this essentially people are so dug in. It's like politics right now in the US, right? People are so dug in, whether they're left or right or whatever, that no matter what, they're going to fight about it. And that doesn't allow for a real conversation. And so, like I said, I think Last Jedi is a story that is, and I liked your perspective in that it was a very different type of story. And clearly it was a mistake by Lucasfilm and Disney to just sort of say, make one movie and then let's follow it up with the next one and let's do the one after that. The MCU model was completely ignored. There should have been a plan for all three movies. And Rian Johnson could have built into that plan. But I walked out of The Last Jedi saying, we don't need an episode 9 because the story
Mm.
wrapped up in a way, right? It wasn't the bad guys were defeated, but the story wrapped up enough so that and that's, Rian Johnson has said he never leaves anything on the table. He doesn't create a movie to create a sequel. And I think maybe there should have been more philosophical conversations at Lucasfilm about where, I mean, The Last Jedi as a movie may have worked individually. It may have worked on it if it wasn't part of the saga, if it was an
Mm.
interesting story, because it is an interesting story to see what happened to Luke. Why, what happens after you are the hero of the galaxy and you save the the galaxy from this evil galactic empire and defeat Darth Vader and the Emperor? What happens to a human being when that kind of pressure falls on them and they get older and they deal with all these things? It's a great story, but it doesn't flow real nice from Empire to Jedi to the Force Awakens. It's kind of
Not at all.
honestly, it's a great side story. And maybe that's
It's a
why it
great
didn't
side
connect.
story, and I think it's a great Ryan Johnson story and
Yeah.
film and movie, and I think that has become a bigger problem that I've noticed with Star Wars is that you have some people who I think like J.J. Abrams is a great example of. Well, let's tell the story of Star Wars. Let's kind of keep this going in a certain direction. Or even
Yep.
Dave Filoni, even though I've criticized him a little bit more about putting his story into Star Wars more and more. With Ryan Johnson's approach to The Last Jedi, it seemed more to him that it was more important to tell his story and his version of what he would like to see with Star Wars, as opposed to what was being set up in The Force Awakens.
Yep.
And I think that derailed it so much that, like you said, at the end of episode 8, you're kind of like, well, why would I even need to tune in for episode 9? What's the point of any of this
Right.
anymore? And I feel like a big problem that a lot of people had with The Last Jedi, and one thing I've noticed with Star Wars of late is that there's become a morally gray area now with the heroes and the villains. And I think The Last Jedi kind of amplified this. And it's one of my big complaints I've had since the prequels, which is the Jedi are the bad guys. They've kind of constantly become a little bit more and more, oh, are they really the good guys? And The Last Jedi amplified that a little bit. Acolyte doubled down on it a little bit more. And you still have that constantly going on in Star Wars now where it's like, well, the Jedi are good, but they have their flaws, they have their failures, and we kind of need to focus on that a little bit more. And I think that actually has done a little bit more harm to the brand than good because now it has gotten to a point where you're watching something like The Acolyte and you're like, okay, well, who are the actual good guys? This murderous Sith over here who wants to feel free to murder people, or Soul, who's a Jedi who, yeah, he killed their mom or whatever, but he was doing it for good reason. At the end of it, you're like, I'm watching this good person and I'm being told that he's bad, getting choked to death by his own apprentice. It's changed
Well,
how we look at the
and
Jedi.
I don't think it's just Star Wars. I actually think George Lucas started that with the prequels by showing us that the Jedi were not this perfect on a pedestal type of body of, whatever, I'm using the wrong words. It's late on a Friday, but it's George Lucas started the Jedi aren't all perfect story. And I think people need to
Mhm.
be comfortable with that. But I also think, to your point about, we're in a position right now from a storytelling perspective that is frustrating. And I think it's going to hurt some great franchises, not just Star Wars in the long run, in that we're showing the good side of the villain. I do believe that we are in a world where things are morally ambiguous, right? I say this all the time on Around the Galaxy. In 1977, the rebels versus the empire was very easy to swallow. It was good guys versus bad guys. We didn't think about it. I mean, by today's standards, if you take a certain perspective, you could say that the the rebels were terrorists, right? I mean,
Mhm.
they bombed the Death Star, killed millions of people, blah blah blah. But in 1977, it was good guys, bad guys. By the time you get to now, every single story. I mean, I look at things like what is it, the Maleficent, um, from Disney. I hated that concept. She's the bad guy. The world Good stories allow you to have, not all good stories, but good stories allow you to have a bad guy and a good guy. And it's okay that they're bad because they're bad, because you're telling, and that's where Star Wars lives, is this mythical place. And in myth, you don't know why, why is Zeus doing what he's doing? I don't know. He's Zeus, right? And so, like, that's all you need to know in many cases. That being said, The Last Jedi dug into kind of the other side of the hero. What are the flaws of the hero, which can be interesting and build a nice arc, but I don't think people wanted that story when they think of Star Wars. They want their Luke Skywalker hero. And I understand the hashtag not my Luke Skywalker. I get it. Um it just feels like there's so much anger about it, though. The conversations are nearly impossible to have. I don't know if I
No, and
made any sense in that.
I no, no, no. That does make a lot of sense because it is multiple layers, and what you're saying at the end, where it people get like genuinely upset about this thing. As someone who does think of Luke as like my favorite character, or at least as like a Jedi growing up and everything like
Mhm.
that, it is almost heartbreaking, honestly, going to see and one of the reason it is kind of heartbreaking, I think some people almost take it personal as like, "How dare you have done this?" Is because it's
Sure.
like, well, it's been 40 years. I wanted to say all we really wanted from Luke after Return of the Jedi is just, what does his Jedi Order look like?
Mhm.
And not only did not get that, we got a completely different Luke who was completely different from what we left in Return of the Jedi, but we also are never going to see him do that Jedi Order. We're never going to see him reunite with Han. We're never going to see him reunite with Leia. I mean, he did as like a Force ghost or whatever, but still, those simple things that are course member berries and kind of easy check marks to hit, I think they actually would have benefited this trilogy a little bit more, and not had this kind of vitriol against it, because now it's like, well, you can't do this again. This isn't like, the Marvel or DC movies where, maybe Michael Keaton's Batman movies weren't all that great, but hey, you get to see him in the Flash, right? You get to see that or something. You
Right.
don't get that with Star Wars, and so it's really discouraging what we have the conversation now about Ray being the future of the Jedi Order and everything. It's like, well, that's fine if she does it, but I didn't want to see that. I did want to see Luke do it. And then there's a conversation around, well, should you even give the fans what they want to see? And I
Well,
think the
yeah.
problem is The Force Awakens set it up and like, well, we'll give you a little bit of what you want to see by adding some new stuff too. You're gonna remember why you liked it, but you're gonna add some new stuff. The Last Jedi almost insulted you for wanting to remember any of this stuff. Where no, this isn't the Luke that you remember. This is the Luke with a lot of trauma and tragedy in his past and has fundamentally changed. And my big sticking point with that characterization of Luke is that you didn't see that change. The big thing I compare it to is like Frodo. If you
Mm.
jumped from Frodo at the beginning of Fellowship to Frodo pulling a knife out on Sam at the end of the Two Towers, or having him go away because of the fight with Gollum and everything, it wouldn't really make a lot of sense, because you'd go from, well, wait, Frodo is like happy go lucky, he really loves Sam. Why is he pulling out a sword on him and trying to kill him? But because you see over the three movies that are like 9 hours in total, you see him get corrupted by the ring. We didn't have that experience with Luke. It went from, he's happy, he just defeated the dark side, he's truly a Jedi now, he redeemed his father, to, and now he gave up on everything and the Jedi and
Oh,
whatnot. It's
yeah, but I mean,
underwhelming.
that's kind of that's par for the course. That's what Kenobi did. That's what Yoda did. And I think if and this is kind of the heart of when people say, if you don't like The Last Jedi, you don't understand it. And I'm not saying
Mhm.
that you don't understand it at all, but what I'm saying is the perspective that I bring to it is that, to me, Luke Skywalker did the most heroic thing he possibly could have done, right? yes, he tried to start his own Jedi Order. We saw issue with we saw three different versions of what happened between him and his nephew, right? We don't know exactly what happened, but we do know that Luke said when he looked at him, he saw that he was going to destroy everything that he loved. So to respond to that in the way he did is not entirely surprising, and he did not lower the blade on him, right? So there's that. And at the end of the day, he literally sacrificed himself to save his sister, to save the rebellion, and to save his student, and ultimately, allow for his nephew to escape as well. So, and on top of that, at the very end of the movie, we see that he inspired the galaxy, right? When Leia was saying, nobody's listening. By the time you get to the end of The Rise of Skywalker, which is my least favorite Star Wars movie of all time, you do see that he's inspired. The rebellion has been or the resistance has been re-inspired. I mean, honestly, from day one, I didn't like that the Empire was reborn as the First Order. That's a whole other issue entirely. But at the end of the day, Luke Skywalker in The Last Jedi did the most Jedi possible thing he could do. And that's what I don't. To me, that's where it's a frustrating conversation, because that to me is so obvious that was the objective there. And it's missed. He did come down and face the First Order with just his lightsaber. He just did it, through this force projection, but he literally stood in front of a line of walkers holding his lightsaber and allowed his friends and the rebellion to escape.
No, you're right, and that ending of him doing that, it is a very Jedi-like thing. I think the reason though that is forgotten about and almost not even mentioned is because he's almost just fixing his own mistakes with that. A big problem that I have with Luke in The Last Jedi and everything like that is not that he, kind of changes his mind throughout the thing. It's like, okay, I understand he has an arc, but it is the idea that, well, trillions of people just died in the last movie. The First Order has been running around for however long,
Mhm.
and Luke has kind of given up on everybody. And even at the beginning of the movie, when Ray is like, hey, Han is dead. Your sister needs you. We need you. The dark side is about to take over, and he's just like, go away.
Mm.
It's stuff like that. I understand he's not a Jedi at that point, but after becoming a Jedi Master and after going through all the trials and tribulations that he had to go through in the original trilogy, it's almost like you never really got to see Luke be the Jedi we wanted, because he wasn't a Jedi throughout Return of the Jedi. He was at the very end of it. And
Mhm.
then Force Awakens, you don't see him but for a second. And then in The Last Jedi, he's a Jedi at the end. But there's so much that goes on before that that I think Ryan Johnson just wanted the audience to accept for him to get to that very Jedi moment at the end where he's not actually even there. He's doing a force projection and not even having to fight anybody in the first place, which is very Jedi like.
Mhm.
But I think him fixing his own messes and stuff like that, it's like, well, you had to give up on the Jedi to become a Jedi again. And especially with the character like Luke, it wasn't, what's it called? The suspension of disbelief
Yeah.
or something. Like I couldn't buy it. And I think a lot of people didn't buy it either. And that's been such a pivotal conversation today of, even like you're talking about the three different flashback scenes with Kylo Ren. Luke pulls his lightsaber out and he ignites it and stuff like that. That is a pivotal moment where a lot of people look at that and go, okay, was that truly a moment of instinct, or was he trying to kill him? Because why would you ignite your lightsaber if you weren't trying to kill him? Even in the Acolyte, Homegirl says, like, a Jedi only pulls out her weapon when she intends to kill. It's like,
Yeah.
well, if I was a writer at Lucasfilm, I'd have been like, please, for the love of God, do not put that part in, because people are going to add to that
Yep.
argument right there.
Yep. No, I think, listen, I think I think really it comes down to, and it's directly related to people being upset about the EU being turned into Legends, right? Because
Hmm.
that's where we saw Luke do all his Jedi stuff, right? That's where he was there. I didn't even read all the stuff. There was so much, and some of it was just frankly, really ridiculous
Awful,
and
absolutely
sci-fi
awful.
and
There's
just
a
really
lot of that
bad.
are just awful.
But there was a lot of really cool stuff where we got the Luke that that all fans wanted to see, Jedi Luke. And we just got it in a different format. So I think that's where it ultimately comes down to, is what is the what was it comes down to expectation. And I think that that's the biggest problem with everything. As I'm watching things like Skeleton Crew, one of the great things about Skeleton Crew is that it's not directly impacted by the larger story. So my expectations are a lot more metered and tempered. I mean, here's the thing. When I walked into and I've shared this before, and it may be an important thing to understand about my perspective on Last Jedi. I thought I knew what was going to happen in Last Jedi. Like I even, for all intents and purposes, I wrote my own treatment of what I thought that movie was going to be. And I thought the Knights of Ren were going to play a part in it. And I thought it was going to be this, and I thought it was going to be that. And I walked out of that movie, like I said before, and I said, we don't need an episode 9. But I also said that it was both the best and worst Star Wars movie I'd ever seen because I didn't know how to respond to it. And I think a lot of it goes back to my expectation going in. I thought, like everybody, we were going to see more Luke Skywalker in action. We were going to see more Jedi Luke. And we didn't, but we got a different type of story. And, I'm glad we had this conversation because I've never looked at it before the way you brought it up in the concept of it's, it's an interesting story. I think it's a great story. Not everybody thinks it's a great story. I think it's a great story, but it doesn't fit as number 8 in the saga. In fact, I interviewed, I think it was Mike Chen, one of the Star Wars authors, and he said the best thing that could have happened to the sequel trilogy was to just make them the continuing adventures of the Star Wars story and not made them 7, 8, and 9, because the amount of pressure that's on them, I think the world may have reacted differently to The Last Jedi if it was a movie that just came out on its own and it was a Luke Skywalker story. And they're like, oh, wow, I wonder what happened to put him in this spot. And maybe I agree, maybe we should have gotten more information to understand what happened to get him into that sort of depressed state. But it was thrown in the middle of the final trilogy, and it doesn't fit for a lot of people. And frankly, I think that's why Rise of Skywalker is such a mess as well, because it just there's no cohesion between 1, 2, or 7, 8, and 9, and that's a big problem.
Well, yeah, and there's clearly a course correction going on with episode 9 following The Last Jedi. And the planning of the sequels and everything, there's so much to get into with those movies in and of
Mhm,
itself and everything. But with The Last Jedi and Ryan Johnson, I do agree that this could have been its own separate story and
mhm,
probably would have worked. I think Ryan Johnson is actually a very solid director. I don't love his writing, honestly. I don't think he's the greatest writer. I'm not a big fan of those Knives Out movies. Like, they're fine,
mhm.
but I just think his writing is kind of not my style. I liked Looper. I thought Looper was great.
Yeah.
That's a very solid movie. But with The Last Jedi and even having Luke Skywalker, I think if they were going to try to do a story like this with Ryan Johnson, it would have just had to been characters that we don't know about, going to a different guy. I actually think him getting his own trilogy was a lot more interesting of an idea than him being in the middle of this trilogy. And what kind of kills me too, and I'm only saying this because they just showed Kathleen Kennedy on this little B-roll footage, is that Kathleen Kennedy is the one who picked Ryan Johnson. She, I think, has the most interest in him as a filmmaker and a writer and everything like that, and gave him this opportunity.
Mhm.
But because there was no sole creative vision going into the sequels, they gave him such leeway with the story that I think it ended up biting them in the foot later on. And I think they kind of regret. And I don't know. I would say it's because he's doing the Knives Out, and that's why he hasn't done his trilogy of Star Wars films. But I think there's a hesitancy on him and Lucasfilm right now to continue with his Star Wars just because of the vitriol that has been targeted towards him. You have accounts like Ruin Johnson who are
Yeah.
still going today, like
Crazy.
people
Yep.
really despise this man and his approach to the Star Wars brand and franchise. It I have heard this defense for it of like it was almost too smart for some Star Wars fans and Star Wars itself. And it's like, yeah, maybe it was attempting to be too deep on something that we didn't really want a lot of depth from. And like you were talking about earlier, where it goes back to ideologies and everything like that, this kind of brought that to light.
Yeah.
And I think that's become a big problem in the fandom, which is this whole topic of the shills and the grifters and
Mhm.
everything like that, and this different ideology. And I think it's important to try to define the difference between shills and grifters in the context of Star Wars, because usually the generalization is that shills praise any and all Star Wars under the new Disney Lucasfilm, and grifters hate any and all new Star Wars. Grifter
Yep.
tends to worry about, getting the money, they get views, you get it by hating popular culture today. Shills get the press invites and other perks by sucking up to whatever brand that they're shilling towards. And I believe the problem in this fandom has become that these so-called shills and grifters have become so hyper focused on each other and their extremes that they've actually alienated anyone in the middle or who are uninterested in this culture war.
Well, so and that's a really interesting point and a really important point and something worth discussing because I get called a shill all the time. Not a surprise. Probably half the people watching right now are watching and know that I've been called that and worse.
Mhm.
And as I said before, this is where you end up having to dig in. But the reality is, y- we're in a situation where there are so many people who are willing to attack people who like something they like for no reason. So I'll take a step back and talk about the content that I create on Around the Galaxy with my co-host and our live show that we do. Um, we are honestly ridiculously transparent, right? In that we tend to come in from a positive perspective because to me, it makes no sense. Why do I want to spend time being angry about something? If I look, I've said this 1,000 times. The Matrix is one of my favorite all-time movies. The Matrix 2 and 3 are some of the worst movies I've ever seen, in my opinion. But I've never once seen somebody online say Matrix 2 is fantastic and then had this desire to tell them they're wrong. That makes no sense to me at all. So what happens is if I go out and say something positive, like I've said online a million times, The Last Jedi is my favorite Star Wars story. If I post that right now, if I post that tonight, by tomorrow, there'll be 100 comments telling me I'm wrong from people who don't even follow me. There's this, and so as a result, I get labeled a shill for defending that. And then as a result, to your point, yes, I have done videos about people like Star Wars Theory who come in with a very uh, he's figured out the algorithm. Let's face it. He's figured out that having a very strong opinion about Lucasfilm and Star Wars has gotten him to an incredibly successful channel. And you know, good on him. I mean, he's really turned that into a very successful business. But he used to be extremely positive, and he's recognized that being negative tends to grab more attention. And we all know it. If I look at, look, my channel is not a high volume channel, but the videos that get the most response are the ones where I talk about the grifters and the people who are so negative and making their business out of being negative. I get the most response to that. And not from people who follow me saying, yeah, you're right. It's from people defending the grifters. So yes, that's 100% it. And then you do have shills. There are people out there who are absolutely getting trips to Lucasfilm and going to all the events. And I won't name names, um, but I will say there is one one person out there right now who actually said something negative about Skeleton Crew in one of their earlier episode reviews and has been backtracking on it ever since. And frankly, it's fucking hilarious. Pardon my French. I don't know what the language situation is here, but it
No,
is
you can say whatever the fuck you want on here,
okay,
brother. This
good.
is like therapy. You can be as open and honest as you want.
Good. But it's hilarious to watch them realize that, oh my goodness, I haven't necessarily stayed as positive as people expect me to be. And this is why I'm so proud of the content that me and Nick create, because yeah, if you watch, it's going to be 80% positive. We are going to be talking about the things that we like. But man, I had real issues with Acolyte. I liked the concept and where it wanted to go, but man, that was a mess. And from a marketing perspective, it was a mess. And from a cultural perspective, they made some mistakes, and we are willing to talk about that. The problem is not enough people. In fact, and it's really funny when people give me a hard time, they say they call me a show without watching a second of my content. But if you dial into some of our stuff or listen to our podcast, we're going to be very honest. But that doesn't exist. And I think, again, as I said at the very top of the show, what happens is you got certain guys. I'm so tempted to just name accounts out there, but I don't really want to do that. Who they're putting out positive. They're saying things like, we're so lucky that we got the Rise of Skywalker. Okay, you're putting that out there because you want engagement, and then what happens is you get pissed off when people call you a shill, and then you fight back on it. And it's exactly the same as the angry people who have been inspired by the negative toxic fandom out there as well, who go after people who have a positive comment. And there's very little opportunity for you and I to sit here and say, cool, here's why I like The Last Jedi. I don't expect you to change your mind, but here's why I liked it. Why didn't you like it? So yeah, I think that's it's an interesting thing.
Well, and what you brought up earlier about how, like, if you tweeted tonight that you love The Last Jedi, you get like 100 replies and everything like that.
Yeah.
I think a problem has become now, at least from someone who doesn't like it and is on the outside looking in. Like, I'm sure you're talking about Jacob, and I'll just name him because I don't give a fuck. Jacob, who does these extremely almost dumb positive tweets where it's like, I'm so glad Star Wars exists. It's one of those things where it's not genuine, and I
Right.
think that's become a big problem with this quotation marks shill side of the fandom who is overly positive. It's become a thing of toxic positivity,
Yep.
and
I will
you
agree with
almost
that. Yep.
have to be. And all those people who got invited to the little Lucasfilm discussion thing that they had and everything. What kills me, and this is where it becomes such an ideological thing, where I think it goes a little bit past Star Wars, is that it's almost clear to me that if you told me what your Star Wars opinions are, I can
Mhm.
almost always tell you what your political opinions are going to be. The
Hmm.
culture in this fandom has turned into the real differences between these two factions, which is a political and ideological difference. Instead of just being a conversation around Star Wars, it's become a conversation about politics, which I dislike. And I've noticed that with a lot of content creators, yourself included. And I've been guilty of this in the past of I know what political alliances you have, not just from Star Wars, but from other things. And if we're following people for solely Star Wars stuff, we really shouldn't know about their politics, I feel. And it goes into
Hmm.
that conversation of, is this meant to be an escape from the real world politics and culture wars, or is it supposed to be a reflection of them in a way? And when it comes to a point where I know as a viewer your
Yeah.
political biases, it certainly makes a large part of your audience feel alienated from you simply for your political beliefs, whether you think they're right or wrong. And I think that is a problem that Lucasfilm has now from an outsider looking in and someone who definitely doesn't agree with them politically or anything like that. I'll see some of the stuff and this whole swagman thing and all these people who get invited to these things. It's like, I hate to be this person, but you all say the same damn thing and you all think the same way. How is it? How is it possible for anyone who disagrees with Lucasfilm or these content creators and everything who all think the same to even really get the voice and to be like, well, actually, I don't really think the Acolyte's working all that well. And then you have the Acolyte fans coming out and saying, well,
Well,
Lucasfilm canceled it because you guys are bigoted and racist, and that's why
and
you
I
didn't
I
tune in.
see it all the time, man. When I go, like, I was, you know, I actually I got some shit from people for saying that the Acolyte did not deserve to be renewed, right? And again, yeah, it's the problem with the Acolyte, and this will absolutely get me in trouble, but I will say it. I think part of the problem with the Acolyte was they led with um diversity on that show. And I am all for inclusion and diversity. You know that because you follow me, who we know
Mhm.
each other. Um, but marketing with that is that was a part of the mistake because what it did was, whether you agreed with it or not, it certainly gave fodder to the people who wanted to use that as a way to hate the show. Now, the problem is there's more than enough reasons to say why the Acolyte failed. And to me, none of it is diversity inclusion
Yeah.
related. It was a poorly executed show. It was rushed. It was poorly edited. There's story issues which worked that could have worked better, but none of it, not one of my critiques is because of the sexual orientation of anybody involved or the characters on the show. Um, but because that became a topic and it became something that was led with, it became a legitimate talking point, and I agree with you there. That's not what Star Wars should be used for, right? Like if I have a different political view than you, and we should still be able to talk about Star Wars. But the other problem, and I need to be honest on the other side as well, is you have people attacking people who are in some of the minority groups who happen to love Star Wars and going at them for that as well. And that causes the defense mechanism, the appropriate defense mechanism, and it makes talking about Star Wars just dreadful. Nobody wants to talk about it because of that. I think the best thing that Star Wars can possibly do is what they're doing right now, which is having a story like Skeleton Crew, which lives on its own, and it doesn't matter. Yeah, you will notice the two moms in that one episode was only talked about by Chris Gore. It caused a
Mhm.
little bit of an uproar, but nobody gave a shit because it didn't have anything to do with the story. It just happened, and honestly, it may be normal in that space, and that's great. Who cares? But now they're going to also then go into Andor, which is going to be late next year, and then it's going to be silent. Star Wars needs to be silent for a while. We need to have a situation and some timing to allow Star Wars conversations to return to Star Wars and not to be part of the politically charged bullshit we've been facing over the last several years.
I agree completely, and I think we, as I guess semi-influencers or content creators, from Theory, who was one of the bigger ones, to some of the smallest ones or anything, it's important to steer the conversation away from the politics and mostly focus on the Star Wars and kind of leave the politics out of it. And well, what you're saying about like it's hard to be positive and everything, or I'll even look back to what we had with the Acolyte, where Amanda Listenberg is like replying to the racists and bigots, and then you have the actress who played Riva,
Yep.
Moses Ingram, with the Obi-Wan series. They focus so much, and I feel like this is a problem with a lot of the Star Wars fans, especially on, I guess, what you would say the quotation marks shill side or the positive side of the fandom, is we focus so much on these negative people, on these people who have shown their true colors. If you're genuinely upset about Reva as a character in Kenobi because it's like, oh, they're putting a black chick in to take away from the white lead character, it's impossible to have a dialogue with these people. It's impossible to have a meaningful conversation. But they have taken so much of the focus and everything. I think the biggest example was with J.J. Abrams. When J.J. Abrams said the fandom, the words, the fandom menace, that was the greatest day in their lives because it was validation. It was getting the attention they want. I think with a lot of these trolls, we as a fandom and as Star Wars as a brand just would be better off leaving them the hell alone. There's only so much time you have in the day to truly hate things, you know? So if you're spending all your time just hating on this new stuff, I've seen it in the comments for so many years at this point where people come to my channel because we don't really have a side over here. We're just kind of Star Wars fans where people will comment and be like, you know, I used to watch the Fandom Menace stuff for years. And, you know, now that I'm, you know, almost hitting 30 or I'm in my mid 20s, I'm just kind of tired of it. I feel like that part of the fandom will die out if we just ignore them and leave them the hell alone. But we have made a point to almost disprove everything that they've said because a lot of it has been false and has been wrong, and a lot of them are truly racist and bigoted. Focusing on that, like we did with the Acolyte and its cancellation, actually takes away from the real problems with the brand, which is not this woke shit or whatever the hell. It's the storytelling.
But
The Acolyte was not good because of storytelling.
yeah, I agree with that. But don't you think that to a degree, when you look at the majority of the majority of the negativity around Star Wars in the big fandom sites, right? The big negative ones, the big quote, the ones that I would call toxic,
Mhm.
they have they have a reputation of being bigoted, and they have a reputation of creating thumbnails with DEI and all the things they are bringing it up as the problem is, and this is why I think, and I, again, I will get shit for this, but this is why I think it was a mistake for Star Wars Lucasfilm to lead so much with the the people behind the Acolyte and their their culture, their cultural aspects that they're bringing to it, because that just fanned the fire of the DEI hating folks. And honestly, what happened was we never had the opportunity to have the real conversation to say, the reason the Acolyte is a problem is not because of the people in it. The problem with the Acolyte is this, and this, from a story beat standpoint, from an editing standpoint, from a design standpoint, all the things that we should talk about when we talk about Star Wars, and that Star Wars fans should be able to talk about. You and I can talk all day about, you know, I love the design of this character. I think this is an interesting story point. I think it's cool they're going this direction. But the second one of us gets into, but it's really important that they introduced an African American woman in Moses Ingram into the Kenobi story. Now it's a different conversation, and it's not Star Wars anymore. And you could have the same conversation about Marvel or DC or anything, Netflix, whatever. Um, it's that kind of stuff needs to stay out of the conversation. But the problem, I agree with you, it's a vicious cycle. When a shill is attacked by a grifter, they attack a grifter who attacks a shill who attacks a grifter, and it never stops. And I have been sucked into it. I have done my best to stay out of it, and sometimes I go, weeks at a time where I can actually avoid it. But I try to keep my conversations in the based in the reality. I do think somebody said it in the chat there. Diversity and inclusion is important. Representation is important, but if I agree and believe that if it happens in a natural way, or if it just happens in Star Wars, nobody's going to notice it, or nobody's going to make a big deal about it, and that's actually kind of what we would want to have happen, right? I know we need to make sure that people are being recognized. I get that 100%, but I think we're in a situation where we're seeing the conversation between fans. And to your point, the toxic positivity fans tend to focus on those same exact political views. And that's where they are. The people who don't want the politics in Star Wars to be the lead of the conversation are the ones keeping it the conversation on both sides. I think at the end of the day, that's what it is.
Yeah, no, I agree, and that's one thing I've hated about the notion where people are like, "Well, Star Wars it's not political," but it's always been political, and it's good that it's political. It's like, okay, well, hang on, you gotta slow down here a
Right.
little bit. But I do firmly believe that the best course forward for Star Wars, the fandom, and everything is to deal with these fandom menace type people is to truly just leave them alone and let them die out because we know what it is. It's a vocal minority. You have people who are just out there saying shit just to say shit and get attention. It's like when you were a kid and a teenager or something like that, and you would say some of the most fucked up stuff you've ever heard or said in
Yeah.
your life just to get a response from people. I think that's what a lot of them do, and I think it's become such a problem now that when the Acolyte gets canceled, the reaction isn't, "Oh my gosh, what happened to the show? Why is it?" It's Lucasfilm is listening to the racists and bigots, and now we're against Lucasfilm. And if anything, I think Lucasfilm, specifically what's happened on Twitter with this whole swagman cringe fest that we've had going on, where Lucasfilm's almost enabling this kind of behavior at this point. I did Star Wars Instagram back in 2014, and still now I'm probably one of the most top 5 followed Star Wars Instagram pages there is. It's not the easiest thing getting media stuff like that. Even back when Star Wars was really popping off and everything like that, a lot of us didn't have any strong opinions on Star Wars where we would feel like we wouldn't get media passes. I'm talking about people with 200,
Yeah.
300,000 followers and everything like that. And so it was kind of crazy going from that era where the people who ran the Star Wars media and Instagram pages and all that stuff kind of kept the professional distance from everybody, where everything was professional. You see somebody at a convention or anything, "Hey, how you doing? Yeah, I know what you do. I know what you gotta do." And all that. Now it's become people who are almost begging swagmen for a follow or
I
merchandise
find that to
and
be kind of
praising them.
gross. Yeah, I mean, look,
It's
I have
disgusting.
a good professional relationship with a handful of people in PR at Lucasfilm. They helped us with our fundraising. We've done for the last 4 years a Make-A-Wish charity event, which has been very successful. They've been involved there. I have gotten, the occasion, but I'm very clear. Like if I do a book review and I receive a book from the appropriate people, I do that. But it honestly, I cringe every time I see somebody say, "What do I have to do to get an invite to whatever?" It's gross, but it's created kind of a weird thing out there. I just
It's
want
created an
to,
echo chamber for me, in my opinion, from what
yeah.
I've seen.
I see a comment in there from a guy named Thumbstick Legion about publicly apologizing to women of geeks and gamers for attacking them. There is a ton of misinformation surrounding that. I'm not going to go into detail on that, but I want this guy to know that 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 is completely incorrect. And just that is there's people have created stories about me. And again, this is because I'm a positive Star Wars fan. And I happen to be I happen to have strong opinions. I've gotten people have literally made stuff up about me, and it's actually really disgusting. Um, but there's a lot more to that story, and it's not up to me to tell the story for geeks and gamers. But there's a real story there, and it's not the way it's been portrayed. So
It's okay. I had my disagreements with geeks and gamers, but I met Jeremy in person back in Chicago. We
yeah.
talked it out. I have been accused of being the reason that Ray Park is no longer involved in Star Wars.
Oh, jeez.
Because I was one of the first people to cover his little lightsaber situation and everything. And it's what's funny is like I guess reality or like I vividly remember seeing his lightsaber on Instagram
Hmm.
and being like, Jesus Christ, is that Ray Park? And then talking about it and people being like, that didn't happen. He didn't do that.
Yeah.
That's all fake. And I'm like, you know how many people I know who follow? And not only that, like I actually know a lot of people close to Ray and everything. I've had dinner with him and everything like that. So like I was messaging people who were like with him the night before and everything. I was like, what the fuck is going on?
Yeah,
And you know,
I've
and
met
people
Ray
were like, no,
Park.
that didn't happen.
I was shocked and disappointed as all of us were. Just a mess, just a mess. There's
Well,
a
and he screwed himself over too because
oh my
they
god,
were
they
literally
were
about to do that freaking God, was it Crimson Dawn
yeah, he was
series or
about
something?
to
They were
really make it big.
yeah, you know, and it's funny because I was one of the first people to report that, and there was a little scoop where I was like, "Hey, yo, like Darth Maul's coming back in live action, guys!" Like, and then like a year later, I think Star Wars Direct or some other site corroborated the news, and they were like, "Yeah, no, like Ray Park's back in live action, Kira's coming in, we got a new series." The day that article came out, he put up
Jeez,
that post, and I was like, damn, dude.
I'll
Not
tell
only
you.
was my scoop solid, now I can never really prove it. It was just one of those small annoying things I can't stand about this little industry. It's awful. But I do want to move on to kind of the current state of Star Wars because I don't want to keep you here all day or the audience here or anything. But the current state of Star Wars is very interesting because you are seeing a shift. I feel like a lot of people have tuned out. I feel like you know, some people I've seen in some of your videos where you say like it's alive and thriving right now. And honestly, I don't see that. I know
Mhm,
it's not the same as it was, especially after like the original trilogy or anything. But even after the prequels, you know, I felt like there was something with Star Wars you can kind of sink your teeth into. And I don't see that anymore. I can't tell you how many YouTube channels, podcasts, Instagram, Twitter pages I've seen leave the community in recent years or simply stop posting due to losing interest. And I
mhm,
think that's because most of what Star Wars has released from the movies to the shows, the comic books and the books, they've lacked a lot of depth and storytelling that Star Wars once had, even if it was the expanded universe. Like Darth Bane, that trilogy, you really have a lot to digest and think about and theorize and talk about for even to this point, almost, 15, 20 years later. The new Star Wars stories, I don't think they have that kind of substance that even something like the Clone Wars had, where it kept you engaged
mhm.
in the discussion of Star Wars or the new shows. I don't feel like those really do it anymore. So I do want to ask you, like, how do you feel the current state of Star Wars is? Because for me at the moment, I would say it's probably one of the lowest in recent memories. I think this year is probably one of the hardest years Star Wars has had, at least since 2018, following The Last Jedi and the Solo debacle.
Yeah, I don't think I would completely disagree with you on there. I think when I say that Star Wars is relevant, it's still in the pop culture zeitgeist. But the reality is, you go to, I'm doing this holiday time, right? So I was in Target, and of course, I walk down the toy aisles and say that it's for my son, but it's for me. I want to see what's there. But um, there are Star Wars toys all over the pegs. There's stuff that is not selling, and that's. But I think what's interesting, and I'll try to, if I don't answer your question, bring me back to it because it's it's interesting. Um, it's always interesting to see that OG Star Wars stuff sells, right? You are
Mhm.
if you have on a peg next to each other Kylo Ren or Darth Vader, who's going to sell? Darth Vader's going to sell every single time. Um, and I think the fact that Star Wars is still current and talked about is kind of more of what I mean. I think I agree. I think that it has been um there's still a ton of people out there. There's still a ton of people who are fans. But I think after shows like The Acolyte, I think even Ahsoka to a degree, as much as I enjoyed a lot of that show, it didn't appeal broadly. You had Mandalorian seasons 1 and 2, which worked perfectly. That
Mhm.
was what Star Wars needed. You couldn't throw a cat without hitting a Baby Yoda t-shirt, right? It was everywhere. In fact, one of my favorite stories is when we walked out of The Rise of Skywalker. We used to go every year during the holidays when those couple years when there's always a Star Wars movie out. And I remember my sister-in-law, who knows nothing about Star Wars. She's as peripheral a Star Wars fan as you can be. We'd go Christmas shopping and then we go see the Star Wars movies, the family, two families together. We walked out and my sister-in-law said, "I thought there was a Baby Yoda in this movie." So it was everywhere. Baby Yoda is the most important thing to happen to Star Wars in years. It's still churning out content. It's still churning out shows and merchandise and it's still there. But to your point, I agree. It's not as people, it's like MCU, and I wonder if it's partially. I'm not going to totally dismiss the fact that maybe the storytelling isn't where it needs to be. Um, but I think it might just be like you and I were talking before we got on about how there's this whole nostalgia bait going on, right? There's this whole, I mean, you look at even Alien, what was it, Romulus, which I really enjoyed, but man, it was basically just take the first two Alien movies and put them into one, and there you go. But it was fun. But like, I think we're all kind of like waiting for that next thing or waiting to get excited about it. And Star Wars is still relevant in that it's still making content. Um, but I'm not going to disagree and say that no, absolutely everybody loves Star Wars now. I think it's become a debating a topic as well, and it's which I think when something's around as long as it is, Star Wars will be 50 years old in a couple years. Um,
God.
it's a religion. It's a political party. It's a cultural representation of who you are. And so um the fact that it's back is great. I think, like I said before, and I will stick to it, give us some time to miss it. Let's go back to longer time between stories so that nothing, it's really easy to, you don't need to be a filmmaker to see that certain things have been rushed out and certain things have
Yeah.
been under edited and certain things have been over edited. Um, and I think that that's a result of this pressure to put things out. And one of the things that I said recently is that, you know, Star Wars is not a slam dunk anymore, and part of that is because of just the massive quantities of it. And I will watch everything that they put out because I am a Star Wars fan. I will discuss it, and I will not love all of it, but they need to get the other side. I always talk about sort of the bell curve, right? And the people that Lucasfilm and Disney need to get interested in Star Wars are the people who go to the parks. They need the average fans. They need the people who go to
Mhm.
see them in the movie theaters. They don't need they need people to want to subscribe to Disney Plus to get there. And right now, I think, look, this is a sucky situation because I really think Skeleton Crew is fantastic. I think it's the Star Wars we've needed for a while, but
Yeah.
it's not getting the ratings because people are like, I'm not gonna, I'll wait. I'll,
Well, like you said, I mean, they're putting out a lot of quantity here. We've had the most Star Wars in the past 5 years than we've ever had, and you talked about, us taking a break, and I actually think it's a good idea, even though it doesn't just need to be a clean break, like no shows and no movies. But
right.
the problem that I have seen over the past couple years is I always, when I watch these things, I have two goggles on. I have my Star Wars fan goggles, and I have what I call the average viewer. I'm a great consumer. I will rewatch The Sopranos 10 times and tell
Right.
you which scenes worked. So
Yep.
I always kind of know which way the wind is blowing. I feel like with some of this stuff. And with Star Wars, at least with the casual audiences, when you have things like Mandalorian season 1 and 2, they release back to back, solid, very good. It shows that Star Wars on television can be as good, if not better, than the movies. But then
Hmm.
you get the things like Book of Boba Fett,
Ugh.
and there's a clear difference in quality, at least in terms of the production and the writing and everything. Just like you said, you don't have to be a filmmaker. Your eyes can pick up on some of these things.
Hmm.
Then you get the things like Kenobi, which yet again kind of raise a little bit of red flags of like, wait, this looks a little off. The story's not here. And you follow it up with Andor, where it's like, okay, this is a masterpiece and everything. It just they've had these inconsistencies in quality with these shows where I would strongly argue that a lot of these shows, like Book of Boba Fett, like The Acolyte, Ahsoka, even Bad Batch, I would even go as far to say Rebels, even though I know a lot of people like that. I think these shows all watered down the brand to a point where it's not taken seriously anymore, as it was before the release of the prequels and definitely before the release of like the sequels and stuff like that. So
Mhm.
now you're in the situation where another Star Wars show is coming out called Skeleton Crew, and it's actually very good. It's actually very well made. I would argue it's my number three live action Star Wars show,
Yep.
just because of how well done it is. That is being hindered in what it could be a good performance because of the Acolyte, because of Ahsoka, because of Kenobi and Book of Boba Fett. When they release so much content and it doesn't even really line up with each other that well, these other things start to suffer. It's the same thing with The Last Jedi releasing right before Solo. I promise you, if they released Solo 6 months later, it would have made some money that was a little bit, missing there or something. They would have made a
Yeah.
little bit more, in my opinion. So
Mhm.
I think that Lucasfilm needed this break from the movies, like they've been saying. But now what we see going on and everything, where we getting the Mandalorian and Grogu, but it's clear that this is a last minute decision and everything like that. They haven't had this one core vision, and I think one of the best things they could have done with the Star Wars television era is just have the Mandalorian go every year for 3 to 4 years,
Mm.
and then after that have Andor go every year for 3 to 4 years. This situation with Ahsoka, where it came out in 2023, we're going into 2025 and we will not be getting it. It might not hit till 2026. It's a 2-year gap for the show. I know they weren't going to fire Dave Filoni, so I don't understand why the scripts weren't ready. It's one of these things with the approach to Star Wars now has just been inconsistent. And what has happened now is that we have experience with it, and there's a lot of uncertainty with the brand going forward.
Yeah.
And so it's hard to be that invested anymore over this franchise now. And I think I don't want to blame just specifically Kathleen Kennedy, because I always felt like she was dealt a bad hand when she
Mm.
took over Lucasfilm. But there is something going on over there at Lucasfilm where it's almost kind of become hard to point it out anymore, where it's like, well, am I allowed to say that this is not going very well? Like,
Yep.
can we all admit that something is wrong here? And it's a little scary, and I think that's a big reason why Star Wars right now is not that big, is because these shows have watered down the brand, and because they haven't been able to get the things out like they said they would, there's now a lack of confidence going forward within the leadership.
Yeah,
It's a
listen,
rough spot.
I'm in fact, I just did a video that I dropped earlier this week about it's time. People are going to laugh. They're not going to believe this coming out of my mouth. It's now is the time for Kathleen Kennedy to pass the torch, right? I mean, you could say it was years ago, but that's a conversation for another time. But now is the perfect time, right? You have this sort of lull in content, and you I think Skeleton Crew is the perfect type of show for her to go out on, because that was her generation. That's what she did Goonies and ET and Back to the Future. She was part of those productions. Um so it makes sense, and I think, to your point, like, and look, and it all goes back to the first part of this conversation about The Last Jedi. It has never appeared to take itself seriously enough to put the effort into creating a cohesive
Hmm.
line, right? And to that point, you have I agree with what you're saying. I mean, look, you can go, you go 2 years between House of the Dragon seasons, right? You go a couple years between, the next Penguin. The earliest that'll be out will be 2 years from now. um So that's not unusual. What is unusual is the fact that they didn't design it to be done that way, right? And I also think, and it's an absolutely a topic for another time, but I also think there is a missing skill set in writing streaming series stories. I've seen it in Star Wars more than many other places, but I still think there's a lack of understanding how to build stories in a way that don't, like, the Star Wars live action in particular often feels like where what they check the clock while they're editing and they say, okay, we're at 40 minutes, we'll chop here.
Hmm.
Um, and it just doesn't feel like it's they know how to tell. Do they want to tell a series, or do they want to tell an 8-part movie? And I think that there's gaps, and to that end, I do think it pains me to say it, and I will be now quoted as saying this, but there's a change in the top is necessary so that they can take where they are now. They have all these pieces on the board. They have a lot of opportunity. Let's get it together. And again, it does. I think Star Wars fans are willing to have one live action series per year and maybe one movie every 18 months, right? I think
Yeah.
I would be happier with that. And look, I think that's one of the reasons why Skeleton Crew is working. It was supposed to be done over a year ago, but because of all the different things happening in the back end, the show got delayed till this December, and that's the best possible thing for it. It looks better, it feels better. They've had a chance
Mhm.
to watch it and rewatch it and have different eyes on it and edit it and do what they need to. And that's what was missing from Book of Boba Fett. My God, what a mess that was. I again, it just, oh, it just, again, see, this is the reality. People think I'm a shill. People think I have nothing but positive to say, but man, and you know where it comes from though. The difference is it comes from a place of disappointment because I'm such a fan. I wanted to, and there was a lot of good. I will always find the good in things that I want to like. The example I've used a million times is, um, I'm a big old school Metallica fan. I was a fan back in when they first came out. I haven't liked any of their like the last 3 albums. It's not that I hate them. I just don't love them. But I'm glad they're there. And I'm glad that there are people who love them because it's making them relevant. It's giving me the opportunity to go see them in concert. And so as it relates to Star Wars and your question about where we stand, I'm glad it's still there. I'm glad they're still putting effort into it, but I think it's okay for us to as a fan base to say, "Hey guys, we're okay if we wait a little bit more time to get the better quality. We're not about quantity." And if it was about quantity, back to what I was saying before, all those action figures and micro machines and whatever, they'd be gone. They'd be
Yeah.
selling, but they're
Well, and
not
there'd be
because it's
more of
too
a
much.
conversation around a lot of these projects and everything than what
Right.
we already have. Like, I feel like, the ending the Clone Wars season 7 is talked about more than the Kenobi series, honestly,
Yeah.
because it was a little bit better and has those impacts and everything. And I do kind of agree what you're saying about, taking time between movies and making these movies. But I think an important thing Lucasfilm could probably try to do going forward is just make it a generational thing forever. Of
Mhm.
every new generation, of every 10 years, you maybe make a new trilogy or something like that. Maybe you have an overarching saga that lasts like 20 or 30 years and you break it up every 15 years. Something. I doubt they would ever do anything that insane, but
Yeah.
I think what worked so well for my generation and why we stayed around with Star Wars is even if you're like me and you grew up with the prequels, and I always say I grew out of them because as I got older,
Mm.
I was like, no, these are objectively bad movies. I mean, I like them and I love them, but they're bad. I'm sorry, that's just true. Um, the Clone Wars did a lot of justice to it, and it released every year for like 6 years straight.
Yeah.
So it kept us kind of in that Star Wars conversation where at the time, we all knew 7, 8, and 9 were coming. Didn't
Mhm.
know when, didn't know how, but there was just kind of that feeling of, no, it's gonna come back. It's gonna come. Like, come on, it's Star Wars and everything. So when it did come back, you kind of left the Clone Wars, you had the gap and everything. There was that interest in going back into Star Wars. It's been 5 years since we've had a Star Wars movie. We're getting another one in about a year and a half at this point. But it does feel like Star Wars has never left, and
Right.
I don't even think it's because of the shows. I actually think it's because of, as diehard Star Wars fans that me and you are, and we're constantly up with the news, is these constant announcements
Yeah.
of Rogue Squadron's releasing in 2023. Oh, never mind, we have COVID. Oh, never mind, we fired Patty, or actually she's coming back
Yeah.
and everything. Lando's going to be a series. Actually, it's going to be a movie. We didn't tell the other guy that we fired him. We have 3 Star Wars movies coming out. And we have another one coming out right before those 3.
Yeah.
And we're happy to say we have a new trilogy on the way too. It's like, what the like, what are you talking about? You're like,
Yeah,
I haven't seen anything.
yeah, honestly, but as Nick, my co-host says, is it's like you don't tell your kids you're going to Disney World till you're in the car, right? Because yeah, and I think that has been something. And again, that's kind of look. I've been in big business. I've been in different types of things. If you're we're in a situation where there is a change of leadership that's necessary, and this is not a knock on Kathleen at all. She has to be respected. She has done amazing things with her career. um but right now we're at a point where Star Wars needs a different it's a different world. I mean, she made the entertainment industry right now. You look at things like the way James Gunn is handling the DCU. I guess it'll be interesting to see how well that works out.
Yeah.
But you look at people like Sarah Aubrey, who is in charge of
20th century.
20th Century, and some other the people in charge of Max right now are doing it right. I think they
Yeah, yeah.
understand how to do that. And I think we need that kind of thinking for Disney. And I think again, the challenge is, and it's hard for me to say because I've kind of fought against it for a while, but I think it's an admission that needs to be, is that when the mouse took over Star Wars, it was going to have to be more productive than it was under George. And as a result, we've seen some major misfires and we've seen some phenomenal wins. And because we love Star Wars so much, the losses hurt more. Look, I'm in the Philadelphia area. So I watch Eagles fans and Phillies fans and Flyers and Sixers fans, and we live and die with our teams. And there are multiple years where it is a shit show being a fan down here. But when the wins are coming, it feels great and we forget about the losses. And right now, I think we're in kind of those we're still in hit or miss, and I think we need to get better back. We need to get Star Wars back to a dynasty, I guess is where we need to be.
Oh, absolutely. But do you think that like Kathleen Kennedy truly has to go for that to be a possibility? Because you saying it's shocking that you kind of want her to go. At this moment, I say I kind of still want her to stay, not because of her proven track record with the brand or anything like that.
Right.
But my big thing is like, well, honestly, who else? Michelle Rejwan is no longer like the big VP over there or anything like
Right.
that anymore. Dave Filoni would be an awful choice because clearly he's a
Awful.
creative. John
Yep.
Favreau, I think, would be solid, but then you would lose the creative aspect of him and
Yep.
everything. I don't want Carrie Beck, who is like in charge of hiring people now, because the people she's been hiring of late, I feel like have not been great choices. And it's a weird situation with me with Kathleen, where I look at her and I go, I don't really know what I can and can't blame you for. Okay. Like, because that's the problem that we've had is like, oh, The Mandalorian is great. Well, a lot of people who are on the positive side will say, well, you better thank Kathleen Kennedy. And then The Acolyte sucks. And then all the people on the negative side are like, well, that's because of Kathleen Kennedy. It's
She's
annoying.
easy to target. Right. And I agree. But I think
Target, just like Lucas was, but it's different because Lucas was the actual creator of it.
Yep.
The problem with Kathleen, I think, is that she is not a creative person and she is just a producer. She is there to give the director and the writer what they need and want to create a successful story. I just think because she's not so creatively inclined, she can't detect what is a good or not good story.
I think the challenge is, and I can't believe I'm fighting against Kathleen Kennedy. This is hilarious. This is not where, as Luke said, this is not going to go the way you think.
Yeah, I don't know why I'm defending her. I can't think of
What's
anyone
happening
to take her out, honestly.
No,
Like, who would be better?
I think if you look at it, it's she's president of Lucasfilm. She's not senior producer. She's president of Lucasfilm. And if you look at some of the challenges that we've seen, you look at the leaks and the overpromising and the $300 million on the Acolyte, those kind of decisions do have to go through her. And so yeah, I think I don't know who. Like I said, I think if it was up to me, I would pick Sarah Aubrey from HBO Max tomorrow, just because she seems to understand how to manage that kind of stuff. But again, that's mostly about streaming stuff. That's not about movies. So, and you know what? Maybe it comes down to this. Maybe the studio model has to change, right? Because you have to be able to create a franchise. I mean, because let's face it, MCU television has not been a slam dunk every time either. There's only a handful of shows that I think really worked. And as a result, it damaged the films. So it's a different mindset. So maybe a Favreau is the right guy. but I do feel like he's much more of a innovative filmmaker than a
Yeah, yeah.
studio head.
It's a weird conversation of who takes over because there were four Lucasfilm presidents before Kathleen Kennedy, but
Right,
none of them remotely had the same job that
right.
she did because Lucas was like the sole proprietor. Dave Filoni, it annoys me when people compare Dave Filoni to George, or think of him as the successor and should be a president, not only because of the business implications and just the reality of it, but Lucas was a writer, director, producer, and company maker. He
Yeah.
had a lot of things he did outside, like that's one thing that I get annoyed with. I guess I could say like the Star Wars theory type fans of the world, where they talk about Lucas and all his majesticness only in Star Wars. It's like, do you not realize that this man is, first of all, not as smart as you're giving him credit for, but is smart in the ways that he, kind of had a little cult classic with American Graffiti, which was, good for the people of that time and everything. That was a really big hit for them. Then you have something like Star Wars, and then you do Indiana Jones and everything, and then you
Yep.
create Pixar. Like, there's a lot to him. And to simply say that Dave Filoni is his successor just because of him being on the Clone Wars with them and Lucas mentoring him and everything, I think it's insane. I think John Favreau arguably would be closer to George Lucas
Yes. Yep.
than Dave Filoni, and would be the best person, just off of seeing what we saw with Mandalorian season one, to keep the story going forward. My big problem now with John Favreau is I also don't know what to blame him for, because he fucking wrote Book of Boba Fett and Mando season 3 and everything. Like, there's the Mandoverse story went in such a weird direction that I'm like, John, what the hell happened, bro? Part of
Yeah.
me blames Dave and his being like, hey, I don't know if you remember Ahsoka, but yeah, I would like to put her in this series too, and stuff like that. I don't know if that's him. I don't know if, what, if he just lost interest in everything. But overall, I think when it comes to the future of Lucasfilm and the presidency, I would say I think Kathleen should stay at the moment because the future is so uncertain. There
Yep.
are rumored 11 movies in the work. I
Right.
think with her, my big sticking point, me and my friend Lunga, who did the Tatooine shows in the chat, shout out to my boy, we would always say she's leaving after Indiana Jones, because
Yep.
we will always say she wanted that last feather in her cap. Well, she
Yeah.
didn't get that with Indiana Jones.
Not at
And
all.
so
Nope.
I think she wants one good thing. I think she honestly wants that Ray movie to work, to kind of validate the sequels. You get $1 billion in the box office or something with a film or two, then she can go, all right, I gave you guys a little bit of a boost here. You take the story forward where you go. But I think she's going to be the one who probably ultimately decides who replaces
Oh,
her. I think it's
100%.
that
I
I think it's
I agree
that
with
big
that.
of a deal. And
Yep.
I think that's where I'm going to have such an issue going forward, is like, okay, well, not only is her legacy going to be there forever if she makes a bad pick, I will always kind of get upset with these Lucas Knights and go, you realize he picked her,
Right.
like,
Yep.
this is all him,
Yep.
not anyone else. And they won't give Kathy credit in the sense of when they hired her or when she got brought into Lucasfilm, it was still under Lucas. And then like 6 months later, he's like, hey, I'm selling the company.
Yep.
And she had to run the show. And then when Bob comes in, he goes, hey, it's 2012, it's kind of the end of the year. You have 3 years to make me a brand new trilogy. I want a movie in 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019.
Yep.
Also, there's going to be a new show for our streaming service. Good luck, sweetheart.
Yep. Yep.
That's hard. That's hard. So there's so many things you can give her credit for trying to steer through that. But as time has gone on, I think she's almost made herself irreplaceable, where it's like politics, where you're failing upward. Or now it's like, well, Kathy, we're sinking, but you've been the captain of the ship for the past 12 years, ma'am. Where are we gonna go?
Yep.
It's a lot. Um, but do you have any parting words you want to give us before we wrap this bad boy up?
Yeah, I first of all, I appreciate your willingness to have a conversation. We I looked back, you and I have actually kind of interacted for longer than I even realized on Twitter, but just because Twitter's weird and whatever. But
No, yeah, I'm a certified hater. I'm part of the haters player ball. Hate, 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 hate.
Yes. But I'm glad that we, you threw it out there, you did your video, which, appropriately talked about my tweet, and we had this conversation. So I appreciate that. And I think, look, I wish I could say that all shills are like me. um, they're not. And I'd like to say that all grifters are like you, and they're not. And I think not that I'm definitely saying you're a grifter or not. I don't know your channel that well to know that. But the point being, I think people need to take some time to talk about it. It's the this is a classic situation of, as we both say online, that would you be willing to say those things to somebody to their face? And
Exactly.
and
That,
and
that's a big one.
and there's a million trolls on both sides who are looking for the engagement, and it's real easy to sit behind your keyboard and call somebody a slur, or worse, and just dig in. It's another to have a conversation. And I think what I got out of this conversation is that we there's a Star Wars movie that both of us have a very different opinion on, but at the end of the day, we're fans, and you've proven through this conversation a point that I've firmly believed, that the place that a lot of the quote unquote negativity comes from is because you love it. It's not because there are plenty of people out there who are negative because of political views, etc. But that's a different conversation. That's not what this is. Um, what what it really is people get passionate about something they love. We both love Star Wars. I've loved it for going on 47 years or whatever it is. And um, again, I think it's also recognition that real fans can recognize real fans. I hate that phrase. I'm sorry I said it. But fans of something can look at it and say, yeah, that's not exactly what I want. It doesn't mean that I hate the other stuff, but that thing didn't work for me. And that's okay. And I find that there's so many people online who feel the need to make an excuse for, hey, I'm about to say that I don't like the Acolyte. That doesn't mean that I don't like Star Wars. It doesn't mean that I'm still not a shill, but I just don't like the Acolyte. But
It
it
doesn't
needs
mean
to.
it's a sore bigot.
Right, exactly, right. So y it's these are the kind of conversations that I wish more people could have. And yes, there's no doubt there's assholes on both sides, and they are there. And I like what you said, it's just that it's hard to ignore the louder bigots and racists because they have big channels and things like that. But that's
Oh yeah, yeah.
but I don't disagree in that it isn't representative of the Star Wars fan base. And there is, I don't know. Ultimately, what it comes down to is the reason we have these conversations, the reason we take sides is because we love it. And that's okay. And if you want to have another one of these conversations anytime, please give me a call. And I do encourage people to, before they call me a shill and say that I'm a blind defender of anything Disney era Star Wars, check out some of our content. Yes, it's going to be mostly positive. I'm not going to lie. If you don't like The Last Jedi, you're not going to love our stuff. But if you stick around and listen, you're going to hear that, yeah, we don't love everything. And it's because we're fans just like you.
Well, and I've watched a couple of the shows that you guys have done because you guys do have great guests. And one of my favorites actually was the IO9 reporter who broke the Gina Carano
Oh yeah.
news
Yep.
back then. That's probably my favorite, just because some small stuff like that does interest me and
Mhm.
everything like that. But I'm very appreciative of you coming on. I know we're always hostile online and everything like that, but at the end of the day, when you start talking to people, it's we're all human and everything like that. And this was a
Yep.
great conversation because, like we said at the beginning, and like you just said, it's good to have these conversations because if
Yeah.
you don't, you're not going to make any progress forward. I think this not only clears up some things for both of us because now I can see a little bit more of your perspective. You can see more of mine and everything like that. Hopefully, this is kind of the future of what the fandom can do because it'll take the conversation away from the overly toxic side and
Yep.
the overly positive side of the fandom and everything. So, thank you so much for coming on, man. This was a really, really good time. This was a really good conversation. It's probably the best um, thought-provoking conversation I've had on Star Wars with someone from a different side, other than what we would do on the Chatooine show, where we just yell at each other and be like, "The sequels suck. You're a fucking idiot. How dare you?" It's been great.
Well, no, this is
Um,
great, and I'm really appreciative. I always, in fairness, when you invited me, I reached out to my co-host, and I was like, uh, what's the angle, or what's the value of doing this? And honestly, I just said to myself, I just want to have a conversation with somebody who seems fairly, and I've done it in the past, and I've gotten shit for it. And I think that's part of the problem too, is you have the extremes. I'm sure there were people tuning in to you saying that, why are you giving this guy a platform? And um I think we proved that you can have a conversation, and I would let's keep this conversation going, because there's going to be plenty of Star Wars to talk about that we're going to love and not love too. So
Yeah,
let's
no,
keep
I
going.
think when Ryan Johnson makes his trilogy, we should
Yes,
go to like the midnight premiere or something like that.
let's do
And
it.
and if I could see Ryan Johnson, I would just be like, dude, what the fuck?
Yeah.
That's the only question I'd ever have for him, you know. Um, but yeah, this was great, man. We'll wrap this up. Thank you to everybody who is watching. If you are, give them a follow. Around the Galaxy podcast. You guys are on YouTube with the Star Wars News Network, I believe.
No, we are this is one of those things. We're nothing to do with Star Wars News Network. We are at at the SSW Network. So it was
Mm.
originally streaming Star Wars, but Lucasfilm did not like the word streaming or Star Wars in our name, and I can understand why. So we are the SSW Network, where you can get Around the Galaxy. You can get our live show on Thursday nights, ATG Live. And we also have a show called Podcast of the Wills, which we do occasionally, where we kind of take a deep dive. But yeah, Thursday nights at the SSW Network on YouTube is the best place to get to know us.
All right. Well, thanks for tuning in, Pete. Thanks for all you who've tuned into the chat. We'll see you, I guess, whenever we see you, and we'll do a nice little live stream whenever Ryan Johnson gets around to his little movie. It's gonna be
Awesome.
great, as my boy Lucas would say. All right. We'll see you guys next time, and may the force be with you always.